Muito bom dia a cada uma e a
Good
cada
morning. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to greet the participants of this meeting. This is an international event on internet governance. My name is Guilherme Ari Plonsky, and I've been recently assigned the director of the Advanced Studies Institute of the University of São Paulo. I will make a part of this opening session on behalf of a partnership that has established in 2020, a year of pandemic, a year of a lot of difficulties, but also of major accomplishments. One of the accomplishments that we are very proud of and encouraged by is a partnership that has been established between the University of São Paulo by the Institute of Advanced Studies with the CGI.br and NIC.br. They are represented by Márcio Migoni, president of CGI.br, and by Professor Demi Getchko of NIC.br. This partnership addresses a topic that is of utmost importance to those who live in the 21st century: Internet. I would like to take this opportunity to also greet other colleagues who are here, such as Professor Hartmut Gleiser, the General Secretary of CGI.br, Dr. Luis Fernando Martins Castro, the adjunct coordinator of the chair and who's also part of the CGI-BR and NIC-BR ecosystem. Also Professor Eugenio Butti, our academic coordinator at the University of São Paulo. I would also like to welcome today's speakers, Professor Augusto Gadelha, General Director of the Laboratory of Scientific Development. We worked together at the Ministry of Science and Technology in the past. I'd also like to welcome other people from the academia, from the University of São Paulo, such as Professor Vitor Bloca, who is the coordinator of the research group on journalism, freedom, and law. This is part of the Institute of Advanced Studies. Briefly, I would like to say that as a result of this partnership, we created a chair called Oscar Sala Chair. It focuses on economics and culture and the power, the economy, the culture, and the power of the networks. We are looking into an issue that is crucial for everyone in the 21st century, Internet under a perspective that takes different angles. We want to determine how the creativity of human beings can be combined with the perception of various needs to become increasingly beneficial to society, and at the same time, reducing side effects that, though real, might have been posed today as just as being part of the Internet, as the essence of the Internet. So I see the Internet today, and of course, this is just my opinion, we will get a more knowledgeable opinion by those who created that, such as Professor Vint Cerf. Professor Vint Cerf, I'd like to thank you for your participation in this meeting. So we at the chair at the University of São Paulo, we appreciate the relationship that our colleagues of CGI.br and NIC.br have with this universe you helped create. And if you allow me to give my personal opinion, I don't see the internet as having a good side or a bad side, or the good side of the internet, of the dark side of the internet, as people say. In my opinion, the internet is in its teen years, so to speak, because in our teen years, there are a lot of changes that take place. So there are some sides that we didn't know we had, and they come up. There are some tensions that become stronger. Some parts of our body even grow quicker than others. Some teenagers, they really look funny at some point. So what we would like to do with this partnership is to help internet to go through its teen years, to understand what it's going through. And I hope that we can help, even in a small part, to get this teenager moving towards maturity to benefit humankind with all its nuances. So once again, I would like to thank Professor Vint Cerf for his generous participation in our meeting today, and also like to thank our partners at NIC BR and also our friends at the university who are with us in this journey. I'd like to thank our speakers too, who generally are giving us their time. Now, I turn over to Márcio Migon from the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. He recently took over the general direction of the managing committee in Brazil, CGI.br. Thank you, Professor Ari Plonsky. I would like to welcome everyone who is watching the seminar today. I would like to greet everyone from the academia who is with us here today, and I'd also like to welcome Professor Vint Cerf. It is an honor to have you here in our event. Also like to congratulate Mr. Castro for this initiative of this chair and for the activities he has conducted so far. Very powerful, impactful actions. I'm all ears to what you have to say. I'm very pleased to be here among renowned professionals. I have learned a lot in the past 2 or 3 months that I've been managing CGI.br. I'm very curious to hear the inputs of Professor Vint Cerf and the debate that will follow his talk. So thank everyone, including those who helped organize this event. Now I turn over to Professor Demig Gatchko. And a good day to everyone. Good morning. It is an honor to be here as part of this panel. I'm not going to repeat all the greetings. They were done by Márcio and Ari. I would just like to put together a glossary of what these topics in this meeting represent. On one hand, we're going to talk about the agreement between the University of São Paulo and the IEA, the Institute of Advanced Studies, and CGI and NIC BR. And the University of São Paulo is my alma mater, although I teach at another university today. NIC.br started in 1989, and when the internet was created, first it was in California, then in Stanford. It was called NIC, like Network of Information Center. So we decided to maintain NIC as our name, and it became very common in some of the associations that support internet. The chair is called Oscar Sala because Professor Oscar Sala was the person who led interconnections in FAPESP. FAPESP is the funding agency of the state of São Paulo in Brazil. He was president of the Scientific Academy a few years back, so it was only fair to name this chair after him in tribute to his background. Well, Dr. Vint Cerf, of course, requires no introduction. He's a mathematician that graduated in Stanford with a master's and PhD degrees from UCLA, also involved in a DARPA project in the beginning. And he wrote a nice requiem, a poem about DARPA. He is the creator of TCP/IP together with Bob Kahn, RFC, that describes that back then in the beginning, he has leveraged and created internet society. He is a person with a significant cultural background, likes wine, likes good things. I think he's knowledgeable to talk pretty much about anything. He has always been seen dressed very formally, with a full suit and a vest. And once I saw when he was wearing a t-shirt, that was a rare sight. And very provocatively, when he wrote the FTC, he said IP on everything. IP could be internet protocol, or it could be something else, and then P as a verb, we will not dwell on that. I would like just to finally say that one of the names that could be used in our seminars could be cybernetics. This was a word coined back in 1948 with the theory of control and automation of animals and machines, and that was recovered in an initiative called Kubernetics. But the essence of that is basically governance. It comes from the Greek kybernetes, that means government. So that will be basically the concept of governance. I think it's a semantic recovery that could be used here. I'm looking forward to listen to the words of Vint Cerf and all the others. And now I turn over to Luis Fernando. Thank you, Demi. Thank you, Ari. It is an honor and a pleasure to be the moderator of the seminar today. We had this idea a while back to establish the strong partnership between NIC-BR and CGI-BR and the University of São Paulo and the Institute of Advanced Studies. So this seminar turns this into practice. This chair that was mentioned wants to discuss several internet-related issues, life in the network, and coordinated by Professor Guti, we decided to have a discussion about internet governance. It is widely known from the technical community and also groups of society that belong to forums of discussion related to this topic, but this is not a common topic in other areas. One of the purposes of this chair is to bring to a qualified environment such as the university topics to be discussed that are related to internet governance. We know that there are no strict rules to implement the interconnection of networks that ultimately will lead to the internet, but there are some bilateral decisions and protocols that are accepted between the parties that allow the network to exist the way we know it. But this is not a work from God. This is something that humans built. So to run well, it requires rules to assure interoperability, stability, and resilience. When we talk about internet governance or cybernetics, as it was mentioned here, we could suggest the existence of a central authority that will manage the way the network works, but this is not how it is done. Governance could be a set of activities developed by a wide, complex network of agents involving national and international audiences that manage and coordinate technical resources, protocols, processes, contents, apps, and systems that contribute to the network and on which the network is built. Internet governance comes from debates of the WISES from 2003 summit meeting. In the past, among various lessons that Professor Vint Cerf has given us, he explains that internet governance is no longer related only to access to the internet by the public. The reach of the internet today also involves human interactions that establish on the internet. Professor Quintarelli says that although the internet is commonly defined as a space of virtual relationships and worlds, this is not a rigorous definition because the internet is real and hosts immaterial dimensions of the world. And in the 21st century, Professor Cerf mentioned that it's already a 37-year-old teenager, but that represents the foundation of social and economic relations between people and companies. It was devised to eliminate barriers and to allow universal sharing and access to information, but in real life, we realize that it's not quite so. The use of internet can also be used for illegal acts, for undesirable behaviors, frauds, moral harassment, bullying, use of malicious codes, malware, also attack to services, like happened yesterday in the Brazilian elections. There were attempts of attacks against the computers of the electoral system authority. Also, we face cases of child pornography. So Professor Vint Cerf is part of the history of the internet, and he's a renowned mathematician. His whole professional journey is mixed with the existence of the internet per se. He was not only a creator, but a co-creator of TCP/IP, the protocol that allows us to have the internet the way we know it today. And he also operated in relevant positions. And ICAM, he was the founder of ISOC, and currently he's the vice president, the chief internet evangelist of Google. In the first 20 years of the commercial internet, people said that the main concern that researchers and technicians had was to deal with the engineering, to make sure that engineering would ensure the stability of the network. And recently we realized that this has expanded to other concerns. There are political concerns or social concerns that have to do with the day-to-day life of those who use the internet. So those are my opening remarks. Now I would like to turn over to Professor Vint Cerf so that he can share with us his experience, his trajectory, about how we have reached the internet the way we know it today and without which we cannot live. And even more than that, we would like to hear about the challenges that need to be overcome so that we can continue to have a safe, stable network that can actually contribute to the human development and to the full exercise of our fundamental rights. I would like to thank everyone who is following us, and now I turn over to Professor Vint Cerf.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion. And I should tell you that the translation worked extremely well. So I want to congratulate the interpreter who was swift and clear, as were the remarks, at least as translated. I think some of us have already noted in the chat that this is not exactly a teenager. The internet was turned on formally and operationally in January 1st, 1983, and it was conceived in the spring of 1973. So it was a 10-year gestation, quite an unusual entity. With regard to internet governance, I'd like to split this into two components. They are not exactly and totally separate, but they are largely separate. One I will call technical internet governance, and the other political or let us say policy, internet governance policy. On the technical internet governance side, it's already been correctly implied that the standards for the internet and the institutions that create them and the institutions that implement and use them to provide internet service fall very heavily into a technical internet governance framework. The standards for the internet are currently developed by the Internet Engineering Task Force. But I'd like to speak a little bit to the history of institutions that have been created as the need has arisen for technical internet governance. And then I'll turn to the policy side and see what that story holds as well. So with regard to technical internet development, very early in the story of the internet's design, which begins, as I said before, in 1973, by 1979, my colleague Robert Kahn and I were both in the Defense Department working in the Information Processing Techniques Office of the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which funded both the predecessor to the internet, the ARPANET, and funded the Internet Project and the projects of building networks that made up the original internet system. There was a mobile packet radio system and a packet satellite system in addition to the fixed wireline ARPANET. The three networks essentially formed the core of the internet, and they were first demonstrated to interoperate in November 1977. From that time on until January of 1983, we were working to implement the internet protocols on as many operating systems as we could, so that when January 1st, 1983 rolled around, we could require that all the computers on all the networks run the TCP/IP protocols, which have been mentioned earlier. So in 1979, while I was still in the Defense Department, we created something called the Internet Configuration Control Board. The title was chosen to sound as boring as possible so that no one would want to be on it. And then I assigned to that board the leaders of the technical development of the internet. Bob Kahn said that I needed to do that, so if I were hit by a bus, there would be a conscious awareness of what the program was doing and what its plans were. So we invented the ICCB, which morphed over some period of years after I left the Defense Department into what is now called the Internet Architecture Board. That architecture board spawned a number of task forces, two of which remain today. One of them is called the Internet Engineering Task Force, and the other one is called the Internet Research Task Force. And the two have different responsibilities. The IETF handles standardization of internet protocols, and the IRTF explores new ideas. So among the new ideas that the IRTF explored was the interplanetary expansion of the internet, which in fact has been underway since 1998 and is currently in operation between Earth, Mars, and the International Space Station, and will return to the moon sometime in the mid-2020s. But in addition to that, we found ourselves also creating other groups that are responsible for the technical internet governance of parts of the internet. In particular, there is a community of root servers for the domain name system. There were originally 13 of them, now there are 12. And their job is to publish the root of the domain name system. So that's all the top level domains, .net, .com, .org, and so on. There are a couple thousand such top level domains. And the servers that map domain names into IP addresses are referenced by the root. So a root servers organization was created. In addition to that, the distribution of internet addresses to internet service providers had to be managed. And so that was done by the regional internet registries, of which there are 5 currently in operation. In 1998, a private sector organization was created called the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which became responsible for managing the top-level domains and also the IP address allocation to the regional internet registries. In addition to that, around 1992, when it became clear that funding would be needed in order to run the secretariat, both for the Internet Engineering Task Force and for the domain name and IP address primary allocations, we created the Internet Society to house those functions for the IETF and the IRTF and the IAB. So ICANN is now the primary responsible party for top-level domain allocation and IP address allocation. On the government side, speaking just for the US for a moment, the whole program began in the Defense Department in the Advanced Research Projects Agency. And that development was the responsibility for the development was handed over to the National Science Foundation around 1986 or so. The Department of Energy and NASA also engaged by building backbone networks in the mid-1980s as well. Within the US government, an organization was created called the Federal Networking Council, which is made up of all of various agencies that were contributing to Internet's implementation. In particular, it included DoD, the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, and NASA, among others. Eventually, especially in the mid to late 1990s during the Clinton administration, it was desired to move this oversight responsibility from the US government into the private sector. And so this task was given to the Department of Commerce, specifically the National Telecommunications and Information Agency, to oversee the creation of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. And then many years later, on October 1st, 2016, to hand responsibility for domain name and IP address management to ICANN as an independent international organization. So, so that's sort of the story from the US point of view. You'll find similar kinds of stories in other parts of the world, especially with regard to domain name management, which are done on a country-by-country basis for all of the country code top-level domains, such as .br. And then, of course, there are the generic top-level domains, such as .net and .org and others. And those are specifically overseen by and managed by ICANN and delegated to parties to manage. So that's the technical side of internet governance. Covers an enormous number of different organizations that interact with each other, collaborate with each other. One of the things which I think is very important about ICANN is that when it was created, it adopted a multi-stakeholder model for policy development. And I want to go on record as saying that CGI-BR is a prototypical multi-stakeholder operation involving the technical community, the government, the private sector, and civil society. One of the most successful demonstrations of multi-stakeholder policy development, recognizing that after policy gets developed, It may be that the parties who develop the policy are not necessarily the ones that enforce the policy. That may fall to a smaller group or a different group of organizations. And I have to say that CGIBR has been a bellwether in the practice of multi-stakeholder policy development. And in fact, in 2014, there was a particularly extraordinary meeting organized by CGIBR to discuss this whole question of multi-stakeholder models and internet governance, which covered not merely the technical side of internet governance, but the other side, which it has been pointed out is necessary because the internet is a platform which is largely neutral with regard to its use. This is true of many such infrastructures, including transportation systems and power generation and distribution systems and the telecom systems. They all are largely neutral infrastructure. And as a consequence, they can be both used and abused. And this, of course, is exactly why we have to have policy and internet governance for policy, because of the potential for these platforms and these infrastructures to be abused. To offer an oversimplification, for example, we tell people, please don't drink alcohol and drive your car while you're drunk. And we ask them not to do that because we know that impaired driving is potentially very hazardous, either to the driver or to others. Property damage and life and limb are at risk. And so we introduce policies that say don't do that. And we say if we catch you doing that, there will be consequences. And indeed, people who are caught driving drunk sometimes lose their licenses, go to jail, and pay fines. The internet is not different. It can be abused, and there was a lengthy and painful summary of some of those abuses in the opening remarks, so I won't repeat them right now, but they need to be dealt with. The peculiar feature of the internet that makes it harder to deal with these policy problems is that it is global in scope by design, and it does not recognize international boundaries, again, by design. You could argue, but the domain name system does recognize international boundaries, but I will point out that the generic top-level domains are not country-specific. The internet addressing structure and the routing system is not country-specific, again, by design. What this means is that if there are abuses occurring through the internet, they can be originated in one country and they can have victims in another. And so the jurisdictional boundaries create a real problem for enforcement of any norms or legal restrictions that one might place on the internet's use. On top of that, we have significant cultural variations, social variations, and legal variations with regard to what is permitted and what is not permitted in the uses of the internet. Now, this brings me to one other point which I failed to make earlier and should have, and that is that the arrival of the World Wide Web in December of 1991 and its commercialization through the Netscape Communications Company in 1994 introduced a vast new application space, which has become one of the primary means by which the internet's infrastructure is used and abused. And so there is an organization for the technical side of that called the World Wide Web Consortium, and they operate in parallel with the Internet Engineering Task Force, with the World Wide Web Consortium working with the protocols required for the World Wide Web, and IETF working on the protocols below that level in a layered architecture. It was mentioned that there was a World Summit on the Information Society in 2003 and 2005, and spawning from that is the Internet Governance Forum, which was created because people weren't quite sure exactly what rules should apply to the way in which the internet is propagated and used. And that debate continues to this very day. This week and next week, there's still activity associated with the Internet Governance Forum ongoing. So I want to now turn to the difficulty that we face in devising constraints or guardrails on the abuse of the internet as we think about this in an international setting. It's very clear that because of the trans-jurisdictional hazards that the internet poses, that to achieve any kind of guardrail effect, we are going to have to come to some common conclusions on an international basis. Whether that is multilateral or bilateral remains to be seen, and most likely we will see both kinds of choices made. There is an organization called the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, and that commission has proposed a set of norms which are not treaties and are not enforceable, but which point the way towards ideas that might be framed as treaties later on. For example, the first norm that they suggested was that we identify what is called the public core of the internet, by which they meant the underlying fiber capability, the routers, the radios that link the mobiles into the system, the Wi-Fi servers, the domain name servers, and the firewalls and so on that are the basic parts of the internet. And they suggested in this norm that we would agree on a global basis to refrain from attacking, harming, and disrupting this public core. The rationale for recommending that norm was simply that we are becoming increasingly dependent on this internet system for a vast quantity of economic activity, for access to information, and in the midst of this pandemic, access to remote medical services, in addition to education and business. So such an important infrastructure should not be treated lightly. And the recommendation of the Global Commission was that its infrastructure, its public core, should be protected in the same way that we agree, for the most part, not to attack hospitals and schools, even in the midst of warfare, on the grounds that that's simply socially unacceptable. Sadly, of course, these norms don't always get enforced, but the Geneva Convention is an example of an attempt to introduce at least some kind of norm that even in the midst of conflict. So I'd like to suggest, I could go on, of course, forever here, but I'd like to suggest that that if we can, that we begin to have a conversation about the issues arising in amplifying the positive benefits of the internet, which have been so strongly demonstrated for several decades now, while at the same time finding ways to inhibit its abuses and potential harms. And I'd like to begin that discussion by suggesting a couple of themes that might resonate for at least some of you, who, especially who are computer scientists. When we talk about malware and other harmful attacks against the internet's infrastructure, we have to recognize that the reason that this infrastructure is vulnerable is because programmers don't seem to be able to avoid making mistakes in their software. We call them bugs, and there's a whole story behind why that term is used. And we sometimes kind of shrug our shoulders and say, well, it's just a bug. The problem is that those mistakes are exploited and in a harmful way by people who have reason to either disrupt the system or to invade an operating system and take control over it, to turn devices with software in them into what we call botnets, robot networks that can then be used to implement denial of service attacks, to generate spam, and distribute malware. So we have the programmers to thank for these vulnerabilities. And so I would argue that on the research side, a great deal of work ought to be undertaken to build software programming environments that expose mistakes, which we call bugs, sooner than they do today, and preferably before the software makes it out into the wild. So that's the challenge for the computer scientists, is to help us make better software that is not exploitable. So that's something we can think about on the technical side. On the policy side, I think we need to work more than we have so far to determine whether there can be not only norms, but broadly agreed treaty arrangements so that people who are abusing their use of the internet to harm others can be apprehended. And this is going to require cooperation across international boundaries. There have been attempts to codify some of these ideas, such as the Budapest Convention, and there are no doubt will be others over time. But it seems to me that from the policy point of view, we need to come to some common agreements in order to achieve the kind of safety and security that people hope for in this online environment. The last point I'd like to make before turning this over to others in this conversation is that to the extent that we agree that the internet is a powerful and positive, has powerful positive capacity for beneficial uses, that we want to make sure that the internet is accessible to everyone on the planet in an affordable way, in a sustainable way, in a safe way, in a secure way, and in a way which protects people's privacy. These are all desirable properties of the internet of today and the future. Achieving that is going to require a combination of technology development and policy development and enforcement. And so, as you probably know, only about 50% of the world's population currently has access to the internet. And even those that do may tell us that its performance is below what they would like, particularly now in a period of global pandemic, when our face-to-face meetings have to be replaced by exactly what we are doing now, which requires two-way, high-speed communication and not simply one-way streaming. So we've already experienced the positive power of the internet. Now we need to make sure it can be experienced by everyone on the planet in a safe and secure way. So I will stop there. I hope I haven't overstepped my mark. I'm eager to hear what the rest of you have to say about these problems, and I look forward to the illumination that will result. So thank you, and over to you.
Obrigado, Professor Vint.
Thank you, Professor Cerf. Among our panelists, we have a few questions. Well, we have questions from our panelists. I think Mr. Gadelha would like to ask you a question, so I will turn over to him. We haven't yet moved into the stage of Mr. Gadelha's words, but let him ask his question first.
Here, and Dr. Vint Cerf, it's a great pleasure to see you again and to hear you. It has been always very pleasurable, and we learn a lot about internet from you. So thank you very much for being with us, and have the patience to tell all these problems that we see now in internet. Actually, internet, when it started, we didn't have, at least I didn't have, the idea of how important it had become in society. For me, it was mostly interconnection of computers for research activities. And it came to a point that I was quite infantile to think that people wanted to have the internet in Chinese, in Japanese, and others, in Portuguese, and so on. I said, why bother that? Because we just need some comments to make emails and so on, and why we need all this thing. And we see that it just exploded. And actually it took a long time for people who started to see how explosive internet was. In Brazil, actually we left a little bit more because of the monopoly of the state on the internet. But when it came with the www, the World Wide Web, and so on, and at the time we wanted to make the commercial sites to use internet, they didn't want. They said that's no use for us. And we see today that every aspect of life is connected with internet today, from banking, from health, from commerce, from social medias, and so on. Everything goes to internet. And so internet has become the ocean where we live in. So trying to make the governance of this very complex ocean and a very complex site seems to me a little bit of a very optimistic view. And when I hear from you that by the technical side we can solve part of these problems, it gives me some hope. And actually we see that cybersecurity is today one of the main concerns, which you say, well, why we don't make internet more secure if our programmers don't make so much bugs? But certainly bugs is part of the limitation of humans. And maybe we will get some way of making them less present on what exists. But the point which worries me is it seems that besides the technical one, and besides the treats that you have talked about, shouldn't the world come to an understanding between the main governments? Because we see today a big fight between big countries, and mostly we see today China against the United States in many aspects. And while it stays in this in this way, is it possible that the internet can find a way of making treats and be implemented all the governance that we have fight for, and the inclusion, it seems to be, it's quite desirable in every country is one. But the problem is how can we control the state control of individuals? How can we control the big companies making their presence in the internet so heavy, and so on? And anyway, it's something that we see that we are in a in a very, very dangerous world today, with this potential of internet to make things more complex and more conflicting views between nations. And so shouldn't we try to make nations understand each other before internet can have a good resting place, or before internet become something that we can trust on?
So this is a very rich question. Let me start by thanking you for using the term ocean, because I think that is not a bad metaphor for thinking about the internet as if it is a vast ocean of content. It's an ocean upon which we embark in commerce and visits and travel and so on. It's also the edge of the ocean, of course, is the land that we live on. And in some way, that's kind of like the internet. If you think of the computers as the land that we live on and the ocean is the thing that connects them all to each other. So also oceans can become polluted. And so the metaphor is not bad. It's not perfect, but it's not bad. And we all know that there is something called the law of the sea, which is a treaty which unfortunately the US hasn't signed for reasons I don't understand. But it is an example of an attempt to deal with a common facility that touches us all. And so it's not a bad metaphor. Now, let me try to respond in several ways to the problem you pose. First of all, with regard to dealing with the problematic aspects of the internet, ideally, if we could use technology to inhibit abuse, that would be a good thing. And we do that successfully in many ways. For example, we use cryptography in order to assist in confidentiality. We use it to do strong authentication so that a device can know whether or not it should interact with another one using digital signatures and public key cryptography as a means of identification. We have two-factor authentication. We do a variety of things. We use cryptography in multiple layers in the architecture. So there are, and I don't mean to suggest that cryptography is the solution to everything. It's just one example. So there are technical means that we can use to try to inhibit bad behaviors in the net, but it won't work for all cases, as you implied. So then the next thing we can do is to say, well, if we catch you doing these things, there will be consequences. And note the way that's a conditional. If we catch you, then there will be consequences. And so those are the kinds of laws that we adopt, some of which are enforceable on a country-by-country basis, and some of which are enforceable on an international basis by means of treaties. But we don't catch everyone who might be misbehaving. And so there is one other thing we can do. We can use morality and say to people, don't do that because it's wrong. Now, I know that might sound rather wimpy, but I would remind the physicists among you that gravity is the weakest force in the universe, but when you get enough mass, it's really powerful. It holds the Earth in orbit around the sun, and it keeps us from flying off the planet. So when you get a large enough agreement among a population for moral positions, you might have a fair amount of influence on the behavior of people. And so ethics becomes part of the solution. And now to come back for a moment to my earlier comments about bugs and mistakes in software, I think programmers need to feel a substantial ethical and moral weight to try very hard to both avoid making programming mistakes and to commit themselves to fixing them once they're found. And by the way, that implies that the technology has to support updating of software in a safe and secure way. Where did this update come from? Was it modified on its journey from the source to the destination? These are all questions that cryptography and digital signatures can help us answer. So ethics is something that we need to teach people who are responsible for software, whether they're programmers or companies that make them. Now, you mentioned China and Russia, and you could probably add to that list others who appear to be doing two things at once. They are certainly investing in internet. China is, without doubt, has invested enormous amounts of money building extremely high-speed internet services for some 900 million people. And they have used it very effectively in their countries. Look at some of the companies that have arisen on the Chinese internet. I have trouble remembering the names of all of those companies, but I'm sure you can think of them. Alibaba, for example, is a huge Amazon-like company. There's the search engine in China is, I forget the name of that one. I'm sure somebody will remember. Like Google and Bing and others, and WeChat and so on. There is payment systems. So China has certainly made very good use of the internet for commerce and for other purposes. However, at the same time, it has also decided to build a giant Chinese firewall around its internet in order to block access of its citizens to services outside of China and to use their system for surveillance. And that's, of course, a prerogative of the, oh, thank you. Somebody mentioned Baidu is the Chinese search engine. Thank you for that, keeping an eye on chat. So the Chinese government has decided that it is in its interest to introduce these mechanisms, and there's nothing we can do about that. I mean, they are technically possible. It is technically possible to build what they have done, and I don't think that our technology can force it otherwise. That example leads to such terms as digital sovereignty, which is intended, I think, to convey the same notion as the Peace of Westphalia did in 1648, which determined that within the geographical boundaries of a country, you have supreme authority. What we are seeing, however, and I'll use the example of the European Union, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is ostensibly intended to apply within the European Union, has been used by the EU as to force behaviors that are aligned with GDPR in the rest of the world on the grounds that they have to be applied in order to protect Europeans from other countries' abuse of the internet. So here we can see, I would say, tensions at the very least and conflict over extraterritorial demands placed on across country boundaries. This is clearly going to end up and has been a major debate for many different countries about internet governance policies. And I have to say to you that we see a similar kind of thing, and Russia is looking to attempt to do similar kinds of things. And in both cases, China, Russia, and others are known to be sources of substantial attack against other parts of the internet, whether it's for surveillance purposes or to invade systems in order to capture intellectual property. In the case of North Korea, it's widely believed that they've been using attacks against the rest of the internet infrastructure in order to direct funds in their direction because they don't have much commerce otherwise. So these are serious problems, and they are not trivial to solve. You mentioned big companies. I'm sure that you didn't include Google as one of them, but perhaps you did. And I feel compelled as one of the executives to point out that one of the reasons that Google and others have gotten so big is that there actually is an economy of scale associated with the operation of these services. It turns out the bigger the data center you build, the more efficient it becomes because you don't need a linear number of people to manage these things because you can automate a great deal of it. So between that and the enormous demand which is placed on these companies, you see this massive growth. Whether that is harmful, I guess we could argue about. And I don't disagree that we have seen some severe problems in social networking in particular. And here we would probably, many of us on this call would agree that social networking has become a very serious problem because of its amplification of misinformation, disinformation, and other, lies and rumors and other kinds of things that motivate really bad behaviors. So, and what to do about that is really hard because the technical means of deciding that something is untrue is actually quite difficult, especially for an algorithm to do that. Some people are placing their hopes on machine learning. And I have to say, I think that is an unlikely solution to the problem. And I don't have an easy answer for coping with this, except to say one thing. Most of those social networking services have feedback loops in them that tend to reward extreme behavior because they are about getting attention. And so if you think about YouTube, getting attention on YouTube can be achieved by putting some very extreme video up that grabs everyone's attention, or saying something in Facebook that is egregious and extreme and gets a lot of attention, or tweeting something which is extreme and gets a lot of attention. So I would fault the social media for the feedback loops that they have implicitly introduced into their services. And I believe we need psychologists and anthropologists and sociologists to help us understand those dynamics and to figure out ways of countering them so as to reduce the level of harmful behavior. Last point, which to answer your final question, which was how do we get countries to cooperate with each other? The answer is there have to be good incentives for that cooperation. And the one which I tend towards more than anything else is the hope that all the positive benefits of the internet will provide incentive to countries to want to preserve those benefits and to work together to reduce the harmful behaviors and harmful abuses that the internet enables, but which we don't want. Gosh, I'm sorry that was such a long answer, but your question was just rich with concepts and ideas.
Obrigado, professor Vint. Eu queria saber se a Liane quer fazer uma pergunta, que eu tive a impressão.
I would like to know if Eliane, apparently she wants to ask a question. So, Professor Eliane, you may address your question now. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And my idea about what's going on that is bad with the internet and needs some action is not really related to these technical aspects you mentioned, because I believe that one of the problems is not with bugs derived from mistakes of programmers, but with people that achieved an economic power, military power, and wants to dominate the world. So internet is a good way to do it. So they are using cyber war, big countries that have clearly that intention of dominate others like Russia and China make huge investments to creating mass of hackers. Or big companies are using their power to impose rules on the behavior, especially on social networks, that not based on good ethics, but they are based on biased ideology, political, any other kind. So I must say that I am a kind of pessimist about if we could help this world become better, just using governance of the internet. I keep asking myself, and now I ask you, how do you see a possible solution to control Mark Zuckerberg, your own employee, and other big companies that can define not themselves maybe rules, but a bunch of lower level employees decided to create some rules and preclude some people in favor of others. This is happening today, and it's not a technical problem. It's an ethical problem derived of the enormous power, economic power, and military power that some groups have and are not satisfied with that. They want more. So give us some hope.
So, well, first of all, I don't think I agree with all of what you said, and I think you could imagine why I wouldn't be in complete agreement. However, let me point out that one thing which will help us deal with the problems you described is more transparency for operations. So exactly what do you do? How do you do it? At Google, for example, we have an incentive to be fairly transparent about what we do, how we make our money, what we do with the information that gets collected. For example, we no longer use email. At one time, we used to base ads in email on what we could see in the text of the email. We don't do that anymore. One thing we do have to be cautious about is that the way the search engine tries to organize the presentation of response is an algorithm. And we tend not to tell in detail what the algorithm is for the simple reason that if you do that, people will do everything they can to game the system. And that hurts everyone because our algorithms are intended to present what we think is the most useful information to the person making the query. And I can understand that you might argue, well, the results are biased. I will tell you, in all honesty, I don't think so, at least in the case of Google's search engine. I think we are trying very hard to identify good quality sources. For example, a web page which is nothing but a bunch of links, we call that a link farm, that is demoted in its value in terms of the rank ordering of a website because we don't think it provides much utility. If it is unchanging, if it's a website that doesn't change very much, it gets demoted because the presumption is it's not being maintained with fresh information. So we're fairly transparent about that. There is a roughly 148-page book, which we publish openly, that tells people how to evaluate your website for its utility in the ranking system so that you can improve the likelihood that your website will creep up in the ranking. We publish that. And it's intentional because we believe if people follow those rank ordering rules, the quality of the content of the website will be better and therefore better for people who end up on that website as a result of search. So I think the transparency here has been very helpful. I think, though, that we still have big problems, as you point out, with countries that choose to use internet and to invest in capability to use the internet for purposes that you and I might agree are harmful. And we might argue that China and Russia and some other countries that are actively distributing malware, distributing, ransomware attacks, attempting to interfere with elections, which we've received in the U.S. and you just mentioned in Brazil. It's interesting when you think about it that that's not very different from stockpiling weapons from the warfare point of view. There's nothing that stops a country from developing military weapons. We don't have rules except we have got some international agreements. For example, certain kinds of weapons like bioterrorism weapons, chemical weapons, are officially banned. That doesn't stop some countries from building and using them, but at least there's an attempt on an international basis to come to an agreement that certain things are just wrong and should be ruled out. Even if you can't enforce that, you might be able to use a transgression against those rules to introduce other punishments for that. And so you see what's happened in the case of Iran. There have been sanctions against the country for its pursuit of nuclear weapons. Those sanctions are not technical, the sanctions are economic. The same thing is true of sanctions against North Korea. There have been sanctions against Russia as well. So one possibility for creating incentive for this misbehavior that you were describing might be sanctions that are in a different domain, whether they have to do with trade or economics or other things that countries care about. It's not too different than what you do with little children when they are misbehaving. You tell them, if you misbehave, I will take something away from you that you want, like an iPad or watching the television or the bicycle or going to visit your friends. And so you create incentives by creating these punishments. And it could very well be that when we look at the internet and the harmful behaviors that you were alluding to, that we haven't found the right incentives yet so as to correct behavior that we might agree is unacceptable.
Obrigado, professor. Eu tendo a acreditar que...
Thank you, Professor. I tend to believe that differently from Professor Eliane. You are very optimistic. And still along those lines, a question from a attendee who asks, do you understand that in the self-regulatory aspects from companies, that would be a good beginning to reach such a level of transparency and ethics to guarantee a secure internet? And we have a second question, which is, will those companies be able to be regulated by states or governmental agencies? So first, a regulatory level, and then a second level of regulation among companies.
So first of all, I think that self-regulation is, of course, most companies will prefer self-regulation to the alternative, which is a regulatory body overseeing what they do and having the ability to punish them with financial or other restrictions. But I think self-regulation does not always work. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that the self-regulation may not be uniform. And if the harmful problems that arise in the use of the internet are not dealt with in a relatively uniform way, then we can imagine that various abuses will continue to occur by creating loopholes or by failing in the self-regulation to defend against certain kinds of harm or protect against certain kinds of harm. So while I think self-regulation is attractive because it is local and potentially effective, it may turn out not to work. Now, this is especially difficult for multinational companies like mine and others, because they are dealing in theory with 193 different jurisdictions. And there are variations in demand for certain kinds of self-regulation. For example, France and Germany require Google not to surface in the search system articles for sale that would profit from Nazi war memorabilia. That's a very specific constraint. There are other kinds of constraints that might be different from country to country. And I have to say that at that point, it may be impossible for anyone but the company itself to try to implement these variations in constraints. Another example is the right to be forgotten, which is a European Union requirement from the European Court of Justice. And it requires that companies like Google remove from the index of search something that someone complains about, saying that my name, when I search for my name, it turns up information which is either harmful because it's about account information or passwords or personally identifiable information, or it's defamatory information, which is either wrong or somehow old. Of course, there's the counterbalancing question. A politician might not want people to know about something which would be relevant to the electorate. And so now we have tension and difficulty inside of Google to respond to the right to be forgotten, partly for those reasons. But those are examples of efforts by various jurisdictions to introduce regulation on a broad scale, as opposed to relying on self-regulation. I think both of those are going to wind up being needed. And in the case of self-regulation, it's pretty clear that incentives are needed in order to induce a company to self-regulate. And usually the threat of other regulation is sometimes sufficient to get a company to behave. But when that doesn't work, then you see other kinds of laws being introduced. Then comes the problem of enforcement. So no matter what law you pass, if it's unenforceable, it's not likely to be effective. And so this, again, is a challenge for the legislators to come up with something that you can actually detect and enforce.
Obrigado. Eu acredito que o professor Demi Guetko tem uma perguntinha para fazer.
Professor Demi Guetko has a question. I'll be short and brief, but the software program reliability, as well as the risk of the internet to be split into an internet Balkan. So my question is, how optimistic are you in order to preserve a single internet? And second, how do you see the interaction between artificial intelligence, machine learning with existing algorithms, if that is a benefit or rather a threat to the mankind? Thank you.
So thank you, Demi. You always ask such wonderful questions, especially that last part. It's sort of like, please describe the universe in 25 words or less, give 3 examples. I continue to harbor optimism about our ability to come to some common agreements about how to protect the value of the internet while at the same time defending against harmful behaviors. I sincerely hope that we will not end up with an entirely fragmented internet. And the reason for that, I hope, is pretty obvious. The sharing of information and the freedom to pass information across borders is very important, not only for the scientific enterprise, but also for implementing the cloud computing environment. And I hope that it's agreed that cloud computing is a very powerful tool. It offers people access to arbitrary amounts of computing power, expandable amounts of computing power at need, as opposed to having to invest in a huge amount of computing on the expectation you might need it. And so here, by sharing the resource, you allow people to get access to resources they might not otherwise be able to afford. That's very important for small companies, for example, that are trying to grow and can't afford to make capital investments that the cloud can underwrite, in effect. But in order to make the cloud useful, you need to be able to move data back and forth between the data centers of the cloud, which is what we do on a regular basis. Why do we do that? Well, part of it is to make sure the data is replicated so that if even a whole data center goes away, the data is still preserved. And so the freedom to pass information back and forth for that purpose is very important. And for anyone who cares about the information not being lost in the cloud, that's a very important property. So if policies are adopted that inhibit the ability to move data back and forth, or if it is demanded that information about citizens in country X must be physically contained in country X, which implies pieces of cloud must be in country X, then that will become unsupportable, because the cost and inefficiency of putting data centers in all 193 countries in the world is simply not feasible. So that's an example of the kind of fragmentation that I hope does not happen, because cloud computing has become such a powerful enabler for many, many different enterprises, for commerce, think about entertainment for a moment. It's turned out to be very helpful to do content distribution by putting servers in many parts of the world in order to deliver content locally, to avoid overwhelming the core of the internet with data transfers that are really not necessary except locally to deliver, for example, streaming video. So that's, I'm sorry, did you want to interrupt?
No.
Keep going.
You have the floor.
So let me turn now to the other side, which is the very challenging question, is what to do about artificial intelligence, and in particular machine learning. Let me distinguish general artificial intelligence from what most of us have implemented so far, which is machine learning, which is a very deep and narrow capability that has enabled computers to do things that we used to think only humans could do. One of them is the attempt to translate languages from one language to another, although I will say, again, in the context we're in right now, your translator is better than any machine translator I have ever encountered. So she should not worry about losing her job. On the other hand, automatic translation of text material, just to give you a gist of the content, can be very helpful. And I know I receive a lot of communications in languages in which I am not proficient, Portuguese being one of them. So I appreciate the power of machine learning to do that. Machine learning has also shown itself to be very helpful in medical settings where we're trying to identify cancerous cells or other kinds of maladies. It can be trained to do as well as many medical doctors can do in terms of diagnosis. However, machine learning is also brittle, and I know Demi knows this. It can make mistakes in ways that we did not anticipate, and which can have significant consequences. So the most dramatic example, of course, is image recognition in a self-driving car. Does the car recognize other vehicles? Does it recognize someone on a bicycle? Does it recognize someone walking across the street? Does it know the difference between a pedestrian and a tree? And it's important to distinguish between them. Otherwise, it will come to a stop sign and wait for the tree to cross the street, which is not likely to do. So the machine learning tools are brittle enough that we need to learn how to predict the ways in which they might fail, and then to build safeguards or guardrails around behaviors so that when that failure occurs, harm is not introduced as a consequence. Some of the failures are just funny. For example, in image recognition, we have cases where machine learning systems have been used to categorize images of animals and other objects. And we found that by making very small changes in an image, just changing a few pixels, you can confuse an image recognition system so that something that looks to you and me like a cat will be identified by the machine learning system as a fire truck. And our first reactions is, how could it possibly make such a stupid mistake? And the answer is machine learning image processing systems don't see the same way we do. And that's why they can make mistakes. And some of you will have heard of generative adversarial networks, which are machine learning systems that try to fool other machine learning systems, and they go back and forth. This has led to a much more worrisome practice called deep fakes, where systems can be made to animate an image of a person and have it say something that that person never said, or to, use green screens and other kinds of tricks in order to place that person in a setting that that person has never been in. And if that person is someone whose words are of consequence, like the president or the prime minister of a country, the deep fake problem is potentially extremely hazardous because it can generate all kinds of side effects, some intended and some not. So we are now confronted in this computer-based world that we live in with a wide range of potential hazards, which the general population looks to the computer scientists to try to do something about. So Demi, you can ask the question, but you are going to have to answer that question as a computer scientist too.
Professor Vint, you were supposed to leave us in 4 minutes as promised, but I have someone who would like to make a question for you. Are you available for a last question?
Yes, let's try.
Okay, please, Professor Vitor Blota. Vitor Blota.
Oh, thanks very much. I think there was a question also from Kimberly before me, so I don't know if she wanted to ask before. I'm sorry, it's not a problem for me.
Kimberly, você pode fazer? Kimberly?
Okay, I'll just do my question.
It's a great question.
Okay, thank you very much. No, thank you for such an enlightening talk. And I'd like to change the subject a little bit and talk about climate change, something that at first may not seem that connected to internet governance, but it actually is. And I'd like to see what you think should be or is the current and future role of internet governance and standard setting bodies in helping us diminish the environmental impact of technologies.
So it's a wonderful question, and one we should all care deeply about, because we are in a very dangerous situation right now, as every one of you must know. I think the internet as the internet is not necessarily the solution to the problem, but what the internet can help us do is part of the solution, and that is the sharing of ecological information, the sharing of models that help us understand the dynamics of global warming. This collaboration to understand the dynamics and to measure it, I think, is absolutely a task that the internet can support. And again, this reinforces my hope that we can maintain free flow of information across the internet from country to country, because the access to that information is very important for fueling the modeling that we need in order to understand what steps that we might take and to mitigate global warming, and what predictions we can make about the effectiveness of those steps. And so I see internet as a part of the tool that will help us steer a course in the future to mitigate the hazards of global warming. Some people are claiming that the internet consumes so much energy that it's contributing to global warming. I think if you do the math, you will discover that this is not the case, and that the bulk of the electrical power that's being used is not in the data centers, but it is split up among industrial applications, applications that are for residential use and for commerce. So, I'm not sure that we should blame the internet for using up electrical power, but we should ask, can we use the internet to help us solve the problem of global warming? And I hope that it can. That does bring me to the end of my time. So I hope you'll forgive me for not answering the final question. But I hope that we can engage in some dialogue, by email or another call like this one, on the presumption, of course, that you found it useful. If you didn't, I'm sure you won't bother calling again.
Well, Professor Vint, thank you very much. We did appreciate your participation. You are always brilliant and enlightening. Our group it's a major pleasure and a honor to have you among us. I would like to thank you and ask Guilherme Plonsky if you want to make any greeting on behalf of IEA.
IEA. Yes, dear Vint, thank you very, very much. I repeat what Luis Fernando Martins already said. It was extremely enlightening. And I would say that what your offer is now a deal. We will contact you again. So you're always very welcome at this moment by Zoom, but in the not so far future, we hope also in person.
Well, I really look forward to a return to Brazil, to Sao Paulo, and to some of my other favorite parts of the country. So in the meantime, though, I'll see you on the net. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nós continuamos aqui com os nossos debatedores.
We will continue with our panelists.
Extremamente interessante, enriquecedor.
It was enriching, provoking, enlightening, and I liked his optimism.
Deixa eu ver aqui da lista dos inscritos, quer dizer, dos debatedores, eu acho que todos já tiveram.
I think that all the panelists have already interacted here with us.
Não, Luiz, eu
Not
gostaria
me.
de fazer uma colocação.
Perfeito, Márcio. Não, é que eu ia abrir exatamente com
It's
você.
okay, Marcio. Actually, I would start by asking you, so I'll turn over to Marcio so that Marcio, you can make your remarks and your input. And I would like to thank you for your support to the chair. This chair arose from a collective effort. I shouldn't fail to mention the names of professors like Cari, Eugenio, Drossman, and on our side, Demi, Glaser, Max. You were all instrumental to make this chair happen. You see the high level of discussions we've had, and I think we have started with the right foot. So, Márcio, floor is yours.
Parabéns aí, Luiz. Parabéns
Congratulations, Luiz. Congratulations on this chair. I would just like to ask Professor Glaser, who hasn't spoken his first words yet, whether he would like to speak before. May I proceed?
Por favor.
No, please do.
Sempre.
Please do.
E é isso. Então eu retomo aqui meus parabéns, realmente
Once again, I would like to congratulate you for this high quality debate that touches on various aspects that we reflect upon continuously. This is an important topic for the government when we want to prepare our public policies on the topip. First, I would like to congratulate Professor Gadelha for the ocean metaphor. Indeed, it was a very smart, appropriate metaphor. And our boss that has already seen the Minister of Science, he has already seen Earth from above, so he would love this metaphor. And I would like to take this opportunity to share greetings from our Minister Marcos Pontes, and who congratulates the organization of this event. Well, the second point that I would like to touch upon has to do with how our life depends on the internet. We are connected to internet from an umbilical cord in all size and small actions, and in large actions too. I have interacted with the Ministry of Defense once. I have worked with GCPOA that was able to bring Iran back to the international system.
Realmente acho que também foi uma analogia muito interessante, muito
I
feliz,
really like the analogy that you make.
Trouxe, porque nos dá a real dimensão do
I think with
tamanho
that
do
we
desafio
have the
geopolítico,
actual,
Eu, como membro do
an actual
governo
idea
aqui,
of
vou me abster de citar
geopolitical
nomes de países
challenge
A, B ou
that we
C,
face. I'm not going to name countries,
realmente a gente percebe
but
que
indeed,
se não são exatamente
we notice
países, mas são
that
organizações dentro daqueles
not
países,
necessarily
são
countries, but sometimes
grupos,
institutions or groups in a
mais ou menos
country
ligados ao poder
might
constituído
be
dentro de alguns dos
related
países,
to the power of those countries. And those institutions or groups are the ones that promote this unwanted or malware or malicious traffic. I think this indicates the size of our challenge.
Registraria aqui que foi citada a questão do longa-manos, né? Do longa-manos da legislação europeia, no caso,
the longa-manos of the European law, as mentioned by Professor Vint, was mentioned. So this is also similar to what we see being practiced in the US with FCPOA, the Foreign Corruption Protection Act, and other transnational instruments that try to improve the transnational relationship through international treaties.
Então isso acho que dá o tamanho do desafio, né? O que eu trouxe até aqui. O tamanho do desafio.
I think with that we can understand how big our challenges are. On the other hand, we can also be optimistic because the problems we get in the internet are not so different from the problems we face in the real world, despite the difficulties and despite all problems, because we also have human ingenuity as a counterpart trying to find solutions. This discussion about self-regulation that goes through governance and the role of stockholders, and even the definition of what is a publicly owned company or not, or a listed company. How can we move from the corporate governance discussion and the interests of shareholders and stakeholders as a whole? How can we move from that discussion into the discussion of internet governance for policy purposes? Finally, as an engineer, I would also like to bring a different perspective, an optimistic perspective. Computer scientists, engineers, and programmers need to do their work supported by ethical principles and guided by those moral principles. But there is also a role for human creativity, ingenuity, and the ability of engineering to create new hardware, new systems, new operating systems as a whole, and work on algorithms and platforms. In an open, free world, all these aspects can be challenged at any point, given the democratic spirit of human development. So, from human sciences, math, or sociology, I think that humankind will find a way for the internet. It's not going to be easy, given this ocean example, but we were able to overcome major challenges, and I am sure that humankind will work together for the pursuit of common well-being. Those were my remarks. Once again, I would like to congratulate Luis and the group. I'd like to say that it is an honor and a pleasure to be part of this high-level group in this complex, interesting debate. Thank you, Marcio. Your words connect with Professor Vint Cerf's words, talking about the need of having several skills and several areas engaged in solving the internet's problem. That's the spirit that is part of the IEA and the chair. The main goal of the Oscar Salor chair is to bring several perspectives from very smart people. Kimberly also has brought a different perspective to the discussion. Now, before moving to the other panelists, I would like to know whether Eugênio would like to say a few words. And even Victor. Victor was so kind because Kimberly's message was kind of left behind, and he was so kind to show us that. So, let's hear the next speakers.
Obrigado, Luiz Fernando.
Thank you, Luis Fernando.
Só quero dizer uma coisa, que é cumprimentar a você e a todo o pessoal
I would like to greet you
do CGI, do NIC,
and everyone
o professor Glaser, o professor Demi. Quero saudar a todos os presentes
I would like to greet
aqui,
everyone here.
De forma ao Márcio, ao Ari, ao Liane, a Kimberly, ao Vitor, que está aqui conosco, Gadelha, mas cumprimentar especialmente o Luis Fernando.
I would like to greet and congratulate Luis Fernando.
Com a ajuda de vários, do Demi, do Glaser,
supported
esse
by
evento
Glaser and Demi.
Marcante,
he was able to put together such a remarkable and important meeting. The words that Vint Cerf mentioned today should be studied. And as Ari said,
uma retomada.
Those words lead us to believe that we need to resume some of our activities. So I applaud your efforts. I am following everything up with great interest. Congratulations. Thank you, Eugênio. This is a collective effort that has been going on for quite some time. It would have been impossible without everyone's contribution, either those who were already part of the team or those who have just joined the team like Marcio. I hope that we can do a lot of interesting things to make this debate even more enriching. I invite Victor to make first considerations now.
Thank you, I'm back. I apologize. Well, Professor Vint just left us and our network seemed to be rather unstable. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank for the invitation, and I'd like to congratulate the chair for this amazing event. It was extremely interesting. And I hope I can keep on participating on these debates. I have a rather general question, more related to the network philosophy, research and communication, as well as the internet rights. Regarding the fact that network and all its algorithms, devices, they have to be seen within this anthropological perspective as entities which have a certain participation and they change the way we relate. Being here today, we have a different behavior from when we are in a persona meeting, even cell phone communication, mobile communication, which changed our interpersonal relationship in our work setting with the governmental agencies. And this is the comment that I would like to raise and hear your comments. Some researchers, they are responsible to make that link with the network activists, which they advocate for this ecological use of the network, and not so much giving emphasis to subjects, but also non-human entities which help us to learn from the network. A technology which allows throughout artificial intelligence a number of diagnoses maybe could have an additional protection than those which is just available for enterprises. Similarly, public management, internet technology infrastructure, how could that be protective from this perspective, which has that public core mentioned by Professor Cerf, but that is empowered by the private sector and sometimes with some additional state arrangements. Therefore, that non-anthropocentric perspective towards internet governance and digital citizenship both could help us to better understand and proceed with this type of policies regarding instrumental needs for the internet. So these are my comments, and I thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Victor. Would anyone try to elaborate on Victor's comments? Maybe Guilherme or Professor Getsko? Anyone? Let's keep going. Would you like to say anything, Professor Demi? Just open your mic, please. I'm so sorry, I was muted. Well, I prefer that our panelists would go first. I'm fine. I'd love to hear their comments. Any one of our panelists would like to make any comments about Victor's points? Liane?
Então, eu achei quando a Kimberly colocou a pergunta sobre impacto, sobre
found quite interesting when Kimberly addressed all these issues regarding ecology and others. I thought that you would refer to CO2 emissions by data centers spread all over. Occasionally, I heard that a 2015 study showed that internet is responsible for CO2 emission in the same level as the air industry. But each Google search represents a cost to the planet, 3.5 million searches daily. So Google would be responsible for 40% of CO2 emissions related to internet search. That is a curious and worrisome information for those who are seeking to save with CO2 emissions. What is your take on that? As we are no longer going physically to our work, that does not mean
that we rule out CO2 emissions. On the contrary, data centers and the whole energy infrastructure to be generated to feed cables and backbones and so on and so forth, they are accountable for this huge CO2 emission amount. Thank you, Professor. Kimberly, you were the one to address the question. Now we would like to hear your take on that. Exactly. I am extremely interested in internet governance from an environmental perspective. And the idea is to have an approach not focusing on our subjects, but in our science and technology studies. We tend to study the theory proposed by a researcher, which the idea is to understand not only human players as well as non-human players. Anytime you want to understand any supply chain and interaction between players, and that is just key. Let's say that we are trying to perform an assessment about point of traffic exchange, PTX. We could not just understand that from a user's perspective and how they are assessing internet content based on that access which is available. Ideally, we should have an overall assessment considering environmental, ecological players, human and non-humans, which are both responsible for social technological factors. And that is just amazing and can be applied for environmental issues, as we have to understand that technological environmental impact has two sides. It goes from users' demands, those users that spend the whole night watching Netflix, as well as the infrastructure itself. The fact that I keep watching Netflix all night long is responsible to a higher demand in terms of video transmission, internet access, data center care, and how they store Netflix contents. So I really enjoyed Professor Victor's comments, because the Science and Technology Institute, they have to be careful and include human and non-human players. Well done. Now you are invited to address your own comments before we proceed to a round of debate with all participants. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank for participating at this multidisciplinary event. We have people representing different areas. I am in my communication PhD, and it's wonderful to have a chance to talk to other fields of expertise. Professor Vint Cerf said that we are all responsible for that topic, especially the impact of technology over society. Those protests that we have about racism, algorithms, facial recognition, and how technology can be applied in a way that may affect some communities more than others. And now that we are all working remotely, that also imposes a number of challenges, lack of information or misinformation about elections, as we had experienced yesterday. All of these, they surf over platforms and tools, and also it will affect the network architecture. With that, I will mention two challenges also addressed here by Vint Cerf. One of them is the self-regulation challenges. We have a number of internet issues where main platforms, they self-regulate themselves, and that can represent a negative aspect, and it's becoming more common to public legislators to get into the debates to solve issues such as misinformation, cyber crimes, and so on.
And some of those solutions that are suggested, they go totally against the internet architecture and how that should work to guarantee lack of discrimination and other issues. I am studying different project bills, over 70 of those bills, just from a state level, not including yet federal level. And they try to turn criminal fake news, where companies, they are responsible to decide what is supposed to be fake news and how to identify those who are sharing that fake news and make them liable for that. This is just an example to say that legislators, they try to solve political issues related to internet, influencing rather negative the internet architecture. I'm not against internet regulation. I am a political scientist and I advocate for that. But once those challenges, they become more public to the general population, some harmful solutions, they are in haste, and there are several things to be done. Some, they have already been debated here, such as legislators, capacity building, and others that are interested to participate in the Congress. But not only, we have to understand what are the reasons for some legislators to suggest this or that solution. And my PhD about lack of information or misinformation, if we are concerned about attention, public attention to different facts, a technological issue won't be able to solve root problems. To suggest a technological solution, not including that maybe be addressed to institutional erosions, traditional media, science, democracy, all of that will not be enough. And to trust a technological solution to overcome apologies is rather rumble, as well as not believe that there is some policy behind the internet infrastructure. There is policy behind it, but similarly, those solutions, they won't be able to solve one single economical layer. So we have to demystify the source of problems to be able to balance our expectations about possible solutions. Second challenge, we have ecology, environmental issues, climate issues, which are key to our society. And the intersection between environment, they should be better approached, and I see that that is becoming part of our debate. For a while, people keep debating on electronic rubbish, and as to infrastructure, people keep talking about having a greener data center to reduce all those CO2 emissions. More can be talked about that. We have a case of a submarine to take internet cables along, and additional environmental impact studies should be carried out. And what is really striking to me are protocols. How can protocols be positive? Telco, international carrier, and international organizations addressing internet protocols, they are advancing on that debate. MPEG, for instance, which is a group which deals with video standards and so on, they have their own protocol ongoing to optimize video processing, as they understood that there is a high content demand, increasing energy use, and if we somehow make a decompression on the video content use, that will also be helpful for environmental problems. And such a demand as a consequence of the use of technology will keep growing with IoT. That becomes even clearer. And we have to bring that to our agenda, consider policies in a very inclusive way from a protocol perspective. There is no solution for that. This is an issue which is really intriguing to me. I understand that the governance forums, they are addressing that, and if there is anyone who would like to keep on talking about that now or later, that will be amazing. These are just some of the challenges challenges. There are several others, such as data, but I reached the conclusion that internet governance is a topic, is an ongoing topic, and a chair like that is key to guarantee a debate with such a level of quality. Once again, I thank you. Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you so much for your perspective. Yes, environment is so crucial, and we see that as a new challenge. No one has a solution for that, but the University of São Paulo aims to really raise that to this agenda within this university field. You have just mentioned a aspect here which is highly related to Victor and Professor Cerf's comments. You have raised the legislation aspect where we want to try to bring back the genius back to its bottle. We want to control that genius by the enforcement of different sort of laws. And you made very clear that all initiatives, they are very harmful, and suggested solutions such as to have a card to get into the internet. And then we have some other social, legal issues where it's just impossible to find one single model, one single standard to say what can and what cannot be done. So first, we need to accept that the internet is not something that dates back to the 1800s or 1900s. We don't have the same kind of sovereignty as we had in the past in international law. What we learned in school, this no longer exists. But you need to find solutions for that. I would like to make a brief reference to the Internet and Jurisdiction Network. This is a forum to discuss initiatives not to unify rights, as the Convention of Budapest that was mentioned, but lawmakers know that some international treaties have limited reach because of how complex implementing them is. So the Internet Jurisdiction Network focuses on the interoperability of law. So it's not like having a harmonious or homogeneous law system that would be used by all countries, because of course their assumptions are different, but there should be interoperability so that different systems could communicate and work in collaboration to meet some requirements, to identify and to punish nefarious practices in the network. All of that to show how complex this is. Victor has raised how we should implement governance in a more effective way. I would like to ask Liane to make her comments. So, in the light of everything that has already been discussed, and I would like her to make her final comments, please. Her comments.
Ok. Eu preparei uma pequena apresentação que eu gostaria de mostrar.
I have prepared a short presentation that I would like to share with you.
Eu sou professora. A professora fala mostrando
I'm a teacher.
dados e
I need
números,
to show data and figures
a
while
grande
I
questão
talk.
aqui era o que essa governança da internet pode fazer para
What
melhorar
can internet
o que está
governance do
acontecendo.
to improve what's going on?
Fui lá, essa era a pergunta final. Então, os assuntos que me preocupam hoje. A internet mudou bastante, né?
Internet
Desde o
has
início, essa
changed
figura aí que eu
significantly.
tirei mostra ela imersa em e-mail. Teve uma época quando a gente
You
começou,
see, it was
né, que todo
immersed
mundo
in
se
email
conhecia, né?
first.
Como diz o Demi, contava
Everybody
sempre uma história,
knew
estava
them,
num
each
evento,
other
alguém
back
passou e
then. I
disse, onde é
remember
que é
that
o
Demi
DMS?
said,
E alguém
"Where is
falou, tá passando
DMS?"
ali, era
Somebody
o
said,
postel.
"Oh,
Né? Então,
DMS
as
is
pessoas
just
se conheciam,
there." It
a
was like a
internet, a
person
ARPANET
that
foi
represented the
construída com
department.
base
So internet was
movimento
rare. It was
em que as pessoas eram
started
confiáveis,
based on a
né?
movement,
Tinha que
and
facilitar
it
para elas se
assumed that
comunicar.
people were
Só
reliable, and it should
que
make it easier for
mudou
them
e
to
mudou
communicate.
muito para
But
pior,
things
né?
have changed so
Então,
far, have
a
gotten
internet
worse.
precisa, não precisa ser regulada, todos esses processos que a Kimberly
So
analisou,
should
né, projetos
internet
de
be
lei, as mais
regulated, like Kimberly
estapafúrdias
mentioned,
ideias para
deals with
manter
really
alguma coisa
outlandish
funcionando bem
ideas to
ainda,
keep
sem
things
prejuízo,
working well
afetam
without any
terrivelmente a economia
loss?
digital, e a gente não
But
pode
they
falar em economia
affect
digital meramente.
digital
Na
economy.
verdade,
You
ela,
shouldn't just
qualquer
think about
economia
digital
hoje
economy
depende da
because it
internet.
affects any economy,
Mesmo
because all economies depend on
pequeno
on the internet.
artesão, né,
Even a
vende,
small
expõe as suas
artisan
mercadorias
will
na internet.
send
Então,
his
uma coisa que me
products
preocupa,
on the internet.
e esse é o tom da minha fala, e a
I
razão,
am
digamos
concerned
assim,
with that,
de eu
and
ter
this is
manifestado meu
why
pessimismo
I
é com a
showed my
intensidade
pessimism.
do cybercrime. O
This
Vint
has
Cerf,
to
em
do with
2014, quando a
cybercrime.
internet fez 14 anos,
Internet
40 anos,
celebrated 40
internet não, desde
years.
que ele definiu o TCP/IP,
Of course,
ele escreveu
since
esse
they
artigo
defined
denominado
TCP.
Internet Governance
So,
is our shared responsibility.
Vint Cerf
Agora eu não sei bem o que ele
published a
entende
paper
que
and
pode
said
ser
that internet
possível
governance is
como
our shared
our,
responsibility.
nós
I don't know exactly what he
quem é
meant
que
by
define
our.
hoje
Who
essas
is we?
práticas? Né?
Who
Como eu disse antes, tem grandes
determines those
corporações
practices?
que
There are
visam
major
agressivamente o lucro.
corporations that
Então, os tubarões
aim
dos sols da
at
vida, etc. Né?
profit very
E são os
aggressively.
países
They're
que visam
sharks,
avidamente
Soros
poder
in
sobre
life,
os outros países.
and they
Enquanto
want
país,
control
como a
over
China,
other countries.
faz
And
uma
other countries
muralha,
like
né,
China,
de
they'll
internet
build
e mantém os
a
seus lá
wall, an
dentro,
internet
e
wall,
os
and would keep their
confina e
own
persegue, vigia,
confined
é problema.
inside with
Agora, quando ele
persecution.
começa
That is a
a tentar
problem.
fazer a mesma
But
coisa
when we
aqui,
start doing the
e começa
same
a comprar as
here,
nossas
and we
empresas de
start
mídia, né, e outras
purchasing
coisas
our
mais,
media companies and other
tem
things,
alguma coisa que não vai ficar bem para a gente. A gente não
something
pode
will not be fine for
ficar
us.
pusilânime vendo
We
isso
shouldn't be
acontecer.
pusillanimous
Então, às vezes, a
and
gente vê essas
working and
nuvens de
watching this
palavras.
happen.
Observem essa nuvem de
You
palavras,
see this
de
word cloud
internet,
here related
governance,
to
multi-stakeholders, são bastante importantes. E
multi-stakeholders
olha o
and
tamanho
other
do
important things.
cybersecurity
And
ali.
you see the size that
Privacy,
cyber
security.
security
Parece que as
and privacy
pessoas
take. It seems that
esquecem,
people
né,
forget
esse aspecto. Então,
about this.
as empresas e os governos hoje
Companies
estão
and
colocando em risco
governments
a
today
maneira como
are putting
nós
at
vivemos.
risk the way
Nós
that we
dependemos
live.
da internet.
We depend on
Eles
the
estão
internet.
obtendo e vendendo nossos dados.
And
Esse fim de semana aconteceu uma
companies
coisa muito
are
curiosa. Eu fui até
selling
Gramado
our
com meu
data.
marido,
I
passamos
went
lá no
to
portal de
a
Gramado,
tourist city
paramos
with
para
my
tirar uma foto,
husband. I
e
stopped to
hoje meu
take a
marido estava
picture.
recebendo
And
e-mail pedindo para ele
today,
avaliar o
my
portal de Gramado.
husband
Ou seja,
received an
alguém
email
capturou a mera
asking to
presença do
assess
celular
that
dele,
tourist
né,
site.
lá naquele
So
hotspot,
someone
e já vendeu
caught
adiante,
his
e já estão
presence there,
passando, ó, passou
sold that
lá,
information to
tem tais
someone
e tais e tais
else,
interesses. Então,
saying,
isso é
oh,
uma
this
invasão
person
de
might be interested
privacidade
in that. This
horrível,
is
né?
privacy
Eu até brinquei outro
invasion.
dia, imagina se tu passa na frente de um hotel,
Imagine if you
fecha
go
o sinal,
just to
tu para,
drive in
o Wi-Fi do
front
motel captura
of
teu
a
telefone,
suspicious
e depois te
hotel
manda
with
uma
people
propaganda,
have
com cópia
romantic
para mim, quem
encounters,
sabe, né?
and
Eu
then
vou perguntar o que
somebody
tu estava
sends a
fazendo, né?
picture
Então,
of your
essas coisas são
husband just parked in
terríveis.
front of
Por
a
outro
hotel
lado,
like that.
nós temos
This could
também
lead
hoje
to
toda essa
terrible
história de
consequences.
perseguição, é o macartismo voltando,
It's like we
com outro
have
enfoque,
McCarthyism
onde ficam
back with
acusando
another
gregos e
focus.
troianos de discurso
So
de
you
ódio,
accuse
de fake news,
everyone
criando
with
fake
hate
news para
speech,
acusar de
creating fake news to
fazendo
accuse
assédio,
people,
pressão contra pessoas
harassing
e
people, putting
organizações,
pressure
deixe de
on people
comprar
and
daqui, dali,
organizations so that
porque isso, por
they
aquilo outro.
shouldn't purchase
Então,
from this
isso
or
é
that company for
ambiente
this or that
muito
reason.
desagradável
This is a
de a gente
very
se mover no
unpleasant
espaço cibernético.
environment for us to
Então, a parte
be
dos
in a
governos, por
cyberspace.
exemplo,
What is the
eles
role of governments?
capturam informações
They
demais,
capture
isso sempre foi uma coisa
information,
que
too much
na
information.
internet houve essa rebeldia rebeldia de
We've always been
permitir essa invasão de
rebellious about that.
privacidade, mas a gente está vendo o abuso do
What we
poder
see today
econômico.
is abuse of economic power.
esses grandes tubarões, né?
Those
Todos
major
são empresas
sharks.
que, na verdade, não são de um país ou de outro, são
These are
multinacionais. E o
companies
que
that
eles
do not
defendem,
belong to
o que
one
eles
or another
fazem, o que
country.
eles
They're
praticam,
multinational
vai
companies.
contra
What they
o
do
meu
goes
princípio de
against
liberdade,
my
né?
principle
Eu
of
não
freedom.
quero ser
I
vigiada,
don't want
perseguida,
to
né?
be
Como hoje está
persecuted
acontecendo.
and
Então,
watched
eu acho que
like
governança
I
da
am being
internet
today.
tem,
So
assim, que
internet
procurar
governance
mais
should
ativamente uma
also
forma de
try to
punir,
find more
como diz
actively a
o
way
Vint
to
Cerf, né?
punish,
Se a
as
criança
Vint
não se
Cerf
comporta
mentioned.
bem,
It's
vamos
like a
retirar,
child don't
né,
behave very
algum
well, then
privilégio
there's
dela.
some
E
privileges
nós,
that
como
they should
consumidores pequenos,
lose.
talvez não
As
tenhamos
small
a força
consumers,
suficiente para dizer,
maybe
não
we're
vou mais
not
comprar dessa
strong
empresa,
enough
não
to
vou mais
say,
usar
oh,
aquela
I'm not
empresa,
going to
né?
buy
Não é bem
products from
assim.
that company
Então, a pergunta,
anymore.
né,
We
que eu
don't
até
have that
coloquei para
strength.
ele, né, como é que
So
é?
I
A
asked
governança
him
da
that
internet
question.
pode
So
ser uma esperança
can
para que esse
internet
abuso de
governance be
poder econômico
some
ou
source of
militar,
hope
né,
to
vai
avoid this
continuar?
economic or
Outro
military
aspecto também que me
control?
parece muito preocupante
Another
é a facilidade
important
com que as
aspect
pessoas se
is how
escondem
easy
com
people
o
hide on the
beneplácito
internet,
dessas grandes empresas, né?
supported
Que se
and
recusam, como o
by those
Twitter, por
large
exemplo,
companies
em dizer quem é que
like
está por
Twitter.
trás de determinada
It
conta
does not
e está tendo um
disclose who is
comportamento
behind
que,
an
inclusive, pode ser
account
passível de
with
ação
a
legal
behavior
judicial,
that could
né?
even be
O
prosecuted
que a
because of that
governança da
behavior.
internet vai fazer a respeito? Como é que alguém
What will
pode
internet
dizer,
governance do?
Twitter, diga quem está atrás dessa
How
conta, e o Twitter
can
diz,
you force
deixe-me,
Twitter to say,
né? Não estou nem aí,
just tell
e
me who
pago a
is
multa, se for
behind
o caso, ou questionam
that
a
account? They
multa
don't
na
care. They
justiça,
say,
né?
just sue me, and they don't
Então,
care.
essas
Just pay
interações que
the
hoje não
fine
são
if
mais
there's
dentro
any
de um
fine and
país,
so on.
elas são internacionais,
Those actions are not
tornam o
national
aspecto
actions, they become
legal muito mais
international
complicado,
interactions,
né?
and
Então, a gente
legal
sabe, por exemplo,
aspects
o
become
Google,
even
houve
more complex
uma
because
invasão
of
de
that.
hacker
There was a
aqui,
hacker
roubaram dados
invasion
eleitorais.
on Google,
Ontem foi
some
aquele caos nas
electoral
eleições. E
information
hoje,
stolen.
casualmente, eu entrei no
Yesterday it was very
site
chaotic
do
too. And
Honeypot
today I
Project
went into
para
the
ver o que estava
Honeypot Project
acontecendo aí,
website to see what was
o que
going on.
aconteceu ontem.
What
E
happened
olhem quem são
yesterday.
os dois primeiros países
Look at the
que mais
countries that
intensamente atacaram os
have
honeypots, né?
attacked
Coreia e
honeypots
China,
more
Rússia
intensively
depois, né?
yesterday.
Então,
Korea,
o que
China,
eles querem?
followed
Por
by
que eles
Russia.
estão knock,
What
knock,
do
knock,
they
knock nos
want?
nossos honeypots?
Why are they
Porque eles estão
knocking on our
testando
honeypots?
vulnerabilidades, né?
Why are they
E na medida em
testing
que eles
for
descobrem, eles
vulnerabilities?
atacam,
And of
roubam
course, when they find
dados,
any
eles
vulnerabilities, they
fazem
will attack
toda a selvageria. E o
and
mais
they will
interessante
do whatever
observar é
they
que eles
do.
têm
So it's
um
interesting
mar
to
de
see
PCs com
that
Windows,
they
porque é o sistema
have
operacional
a
mais
lot of
usado
PCs
nessas
with
máquinas,
Windows
nessas
because
estatísticas
those
aí
are the
que
ones
eu
most
mostro. Então,
widely
também
used.
mostra as pessoas despreparadas
It
de
shows
se
that people are
proteger.
not
E os
prepared to
malwares hoje em
protect
dia estão ficando
themselves.
mais sutis.
Malwares today are
Antigamente tinha um
becoming
malware
much
no
more
PC XP, ele derrubava o PC,
subtle.
ele travava, ele
They
dava
used to
tela
be
azul e pronto,
PC.
todo
If
mundo
you
logo
had your computer and there was
tem malware aí nesse
malware,
PC,
you would
saía
get a
correndo
blue
atrás de um processo de
screen and then you
limpeza.
will
Agora não,
immediately
eles podem ficar
identify
quietos,
malwares.
né,
But
trabalhando na
this is
fundinha,
no
no
longer
background, por
truth
muito,
because
muito
malware
tempo,
can run in the
fazendo,
background
né, o
quietly for a
trabalho das
long time,
hordas. Então,
just
essa
opening the
situação
back doors
hoje
they want.
me preocupa
I am
bastante,
concerned
né?
with the
E eu
situation
vejo
today.
na governança da internet uma
So I
esperança,
see
mas eu fico me perguntando, e aí
hope in
gostaria de ouvir a
internet
opinião de
governance.
vocês, se
I'm
isso é
wondering, I would like to hear your
materializável.
opinion about that.
Porque uma coisa é a gente
Can this
sonhar
be
que as
implemented?
empresas,
Because we
especialmente
might
os grandes
dream with
tubarões
this solution
internacionais,
and large
vão se
companies, especially those
autorregular,
international sharks, they'll
bonitinhos, os países vão
self-regulate
ser
and so
bonzinhos.
on. Should we
Outra
expect
coisa é a
countries to behave
realidade, né?
nicely? I
Então,
think there is a
esses seriam
dream
os
realm
meus
and there is reality.
pontos a ponderar sobre
These
essa
are
questão.
the
Não tenho
points that I would
soluções,
like
só
to
tenho
raise in this
perguntas
discussion. So I don't have solutions. All I
problemáticas
have are
a
troublesome
pedir
questions to
resposta.
ask. Thank you, Liane. I think what you mentioned is basically what I try to express in my initial words. The system was conceived for freedom from a flow of ideas, and it has become what we have today. When you're working in a military environment, there is hierarchy. In the academic world, you have scientific protocols. And they try to contain abuses. But when you open the door to the real world, things get out of hand. You might throw the baby with the bathwater. Demi, would you like to say anything about Liane's provocation? I'm going to be brief, and thank you for this opportunity. Yes, I think that this is that's the problem. First, we should be very careful with legislation, no doubt about that. We should encourage cooperation. She talked about honeypots. Those are groups that help themselves to face those threats. This is a feature of humans. The network just allowed humans to manifest themselves. I think that it will take a long time so that we can improve, work with education and culture to show that there are consequences. We'll have a long way to go. I don't know how this is going to be implemented, but I think internet can help us in that. I would like to make a comment on Kimberly's words. You might have power consumption, and this could increase CO2 emissions or not. It depends on the source of power. So, of course, it's important to have clean energy, but a car also on gasoline burns carbon. And maybe an electric heater that is connected to a power provided by hydro plants that would not produce CO2. We should always try to get energy as clean as possible. And one of the advantages in Brazil is that usually our power comes from clean sources. We should be aware of that. We cannot avoid or prevent spending energy or spending power, consuming power, because we need that. But most importantly is to find clean power sources. With that, we'll have less conscious problems about that. It was a very rich debate. I hope that we can continue to take this way in this chair from now on. Thank you, Demi. Now, moving towards the end, it's almost 1 o'clock. I would like to ask Abeda for his final comments, and then Victor. It was a great debate, very rich. Vint Cerf, as usual, was great. The question that I ask myself that lies behind all of that, and that has to do with what Liane said, is that, okay, we need to have internet governance. The question is, who should be responsible for that? Who should implement it? We've seen a rich debate that has been going on since WCS and then GF, the first edition in Greece, then in Rio. It seems that this discussion is very good, very rich, because that makes people start thinking about those topics. But if you take IGF back from 2007, I think that was the one that was held in Rio. There were 5 topics: openness, access, security, diversity, and critical internet resources. I think that many of these issues have been partially solved, and maybe they are not such a concern as the concern we have today in the forum of internet governance. The concern this year has to do with data. What should we do with the huge amount of data, and how can we ensure security of those data? Also, there's the environmental issue, as it was mentioned here by Kimberly. I agree. We should not fail stop using the internet or stop developing computing systems. This is a reality. We need to find solutions that will make this be implemented in a way that does not harm the environment, or at least as possible. It's like cars. You cannot prohibit cars. So what we try to do is to develop electric cars so that this whole network, the grid, becomes greener and also environmental friendly. So we're also talking about inclusion and also talking about reliability and digital cooperation between countries. So this is why I asked Vint Cerf my question. I'm also concerned, like Liane is, with great nations, great companies, the geopolitical and business interests, national interests that make this discussion, although it is important, we don't see this discussion taking place in the Chinese government, in the US government. And because of that, we just discuss it, but we're not able to have such an impact. And when I talked about the example of the ocean, I think I was influenced by what I've been reading recently. I've been reading global geopolitical arena. It started with the Sagres School back in Portugal. They had enough common naval power. And then the Netherlands became very important because they mastered oceans, and then after that, England became dominant. Also because of their armada, of their major navy power. And I think that most of everything that exists is here. So this is why I see the internet as an ocean. Countries see today how internet is important as the ocean was once important. Of course, the ocean is still important, but those who dominate the ocean will have their bigger navy power. Countries are producing more ships and bigger ships and having more control. I think the internet is becoming what was the ocean meant. Because now countries and companies, they have domain of the geopolitical power through the internet. Can they really give that to society for the benefit of society? It is difficult for society to discuss internet governance. And we should also think about the role of the legal systems and governments. In Brazil, for example, I see that CGI's role has been crucial. This is true for Congress, for legal aspects. It's not the same in other countries. We don't see such a participation. So internet governance is necessary. We need to discuss it. Society needs to understand more about it. So my question is what who will take over this role? Will be large companies? Will be stronger countries? Will the US and China get an agreement on how to operate? These fights in terms of infrastructure required for the internet, will those fights be over? Will they reach an agreement about open commerce, for example? Or are we going to have problems like the problems we're facing for 5G? Once again, this has an impact on the internet. First time I heard about Internet of Things was in one meeting. I can't remember whether it was about internet governance or another meeting, and then they talked about Internet of Things, and I was wondering, what the heck is that? That was back in 2005 or 2007. It was futuristic, it was just conceptual, and now we are witnessing that. Who's going to be dominating this?
Our time is running short, and my question is, who is responsible for the internet governance? Thank you, Gardelio, for your comments, which are intertwined to our previous speakers. So you are talking about tides, about the oceans, that is your metaphoric approach. And we know that there is a natural strength over tides that cannot be controlled by human beings. At most, you can be in the surroundings of any ocean and you may minimally control tides. So it's still along the same lines as Demi and Vince. I would be very optimistic. Ocean and tides are so resilient, which can be strong enough to reach a self-solution. Therefore, governance could be raised from internet's strength, which is highly connected to CGI principles. Once you are able to make that instrumental throughout those 10 basic principles, you are able to create a resilience mesh which will not avoid our current problems, but somehow will be able to raise some sort of resistance. I'd like to hear final comments from Victor and then Professor Demi Gitsko.
Eu agradeço também a oportunidade. Acho que as falas são
I like to thank you all for your comments and for this amazing opportunity to be here today. And my final remarks are to bring to light that to a public interest where organizations that work together with international or national agencies that could really find a place within the internet realm. Some researchers from the critical theory, they bring that to light. If we just let companies to self-regulate them or for a state regulation, we may end up having some abuses and distortion within the public domain. Researchers such as Robert Kahn from Berlin University, he keeps talking about digital activism. And this is a concern from Professor Lianis, who says that behind anonymous we have several detours in that relation. However, that is essential for the internet, for network rights. So we have to enhance and emphasize throughout organizations like CGI, universities, to turn public interest institutions to be intermediate players between companies, governmental agencies, strengthening that debate as all IGFs are doing their best to it. And as Professor Gadelha brilliantly said, we have some boundaries and some restraints, such as the military economic powers that are not really into it. And also, what is the condition of those who are ruled out from the internet? We have those migratory movements, those who are excluded from the debate. What they have to do as part of that network, maybe thanks to inclusion, accessibility, we'll be able to reach new ideas, new governance notions from this ecological dimension perspective to shorten the public dimension. Professor Cerf is talking about an interplanetary internet. So how can we value and consider our planet, adversities and populations as part of governance? That's it for now. And once again, thank you very much. Well, Eugenio, he was totally right once he included you into this debate. And be sure that you'll be with us from now on. Now, Professor Demi Glazer's final comments and remarks for an official closure of this meeting. Well, forgive me if I'm too rumble, but we have to trust internet resistance, which has been assaulted by some waves when it was no longer academic, and then when governmental agencies, they were just, gossiping, such as the Noodles case, and maybe we are able to react. Why do we keep talking about cryptography? Because no one wants their messages to be violated. So we have to advocate for a law like that. But just cryptography is not good for everything because people keep trying to assault it. So let's keep it, preserve it, such as Tor, the Goops, anonymous navigation, anonymous surfing without leaving no trace or whatsoever. I'm sure that this organic reaction of the internet to preserve is still on. I don't know if that makes sense or not, if that will last much longer, but this is a hope which I have. And we'll have antibodies that will be able to generate against fake news, inappropriate languages without being just conducted by all. I'd like now to give the floor to Professor Glaser, but I'd like to run to our end. I'd like to thank you all. It was an amazing event. Time is always against us, but I'm sure that we'll be able to keep talking with several activities and different tools from the academia. Thank you so much. Have you all a wonderful day. Now, Professor Glaser, and then Ari for closing the event. Briefly, I'd like to reflect upon the first decade of the CERTRO when Gadelha was under the management, where we were able to benefit from a higher interest and to found a governance school within CGI. That project took off. We have different versions of that, where this governance school is been ongoing. That is a very intense week of activities, over 40 hours of activities, intensive school.
full-time, and we have a shorter version of 10 hours with some emphasis in legal, with a huge operation from the courts and the legal departments. In this very intense course of 40-ish hours, we had graduated over 40 students. And since the very beginning, as I come from the academia, my goal was to evolve, to grow, to expand our impact. And now I can see that Oscar Sala chair and this beautiful emphasis together with the IEA was responsible for that brainstorm and that think tank where all these challenges, questions may be raised. I briefly searched on my files in 2015 when we celebrated 20 years of CGI. We celebrated with a round of 10 speeches given by international guests addressing the 10 principles of our 10 chapters. Each one of the principles had been enlightened by one international speaker, and we have those Magnan classes with new topics to keep going now within Oscar Sala chair. CGI is very grateful for such a partnership and for this successful beginning thanks to these two seminars. We had a first one addressing journalism and now internet governance, proving that we are in the right path, and CGI wants to keep on investing into this partnership. And as an executive secretary, I am extremely glad and rewarded by our goals being achieved. And I thank you all for your participation today. And I hope that we can keep improving our relationship and above all, dealing with topics that sometimes go beyond the technology and encompass different sectors in a transversal way, not exactly talking about our specific field of expertise. Thank you once again and congrats to all of you, and let's keep moving.
Márcio, você quer fazer a despedida também? Eu vou depois
só
falar uma palavrinha final.
Would you like to say anything, Marshall? No, I would like to congratulate the chair, as we always honor the tradition of Professor Oscar Sala and all his legacy. Once again, thank you, and it was an honor.
Algumas palavras rapidinhas. Primeiro, muitíssimo obrigado a todos e todas.
First of all, I'd like to thank you all for your attendance and participation on behalf of Professor Luis Martin Castro and all his efforts in putting together this wonderful seminar. And he was not only a moderator, but he also added value to all the presentations and our dear guests.
Questões que estão sendo trazidas.
I leave the session with some new information.
Que nós tivemos aqui.
Thanks to all debaters and speakers' participations. And putting joke aside, our chair is named after Oscar Sala. Sala comes from the Latin word salão, which is like a living room, a room where for many centuries people would get together to talk about high-level topics. So this Oscar Sala chair has a meaning of a room, a sala, where we'll be able to meet frequently to deal upon relevant topics, not only to the society, to Brazil, and to the globe. And let's keep going. Once again, thank you, and it was a great honor. One last reflection and one invitation. Throughout today's talks, We keep hearing about some metaphors, nuclear issues, dissolution, how to deal with that perspective. And I would like to suggest a health metaphor, where health initially was created to benefit people, and we do benefit people. Now we have a much longer life expectancy, quality of life, and so on. And some distortions that we had throughout our history, despite Socrates' witness, where innovations such as the CRISPR technology, which are very promising, but also of great concern due to a number of aspects conducted here. So despite the metaphor to the ocean, let's try to keep a metaphor where the starting point would be positive and not a war metaphor, as the war metaphor is a defense. I understood that can be useful, each one of them with their own load, but let's try to have a much healthier metaphor which will collaborate to everyone's health. Those who would be acknowledged with some virtual statues, not with just the goal to increase their welfare or power, but to improve mankind's health. So from a CGI from CGI perspective, I'd like to let you know that from January 2020, as of January 2023, when internet will be celebrating 40 years. So I hope that we will be able to celebrate our 40th anniversary. So let's start with our arrangements, maybe in the next years. So in Brazil, there is a saying which says that life starts when you turn 40. So with that in mind, thank you so much for all of you. We had a wonderful beginning of our week, and that's it for now. Thank you very much to all of you, and goodbye.